John Bunyan, a man whose life had been a testament to enduring faith, found himself in a place he barely recognized. It was a modern-day American church, filled with bright lights and a hum that was completely alien to him. The air conditioning whispered, a stark contrast to the damp cold of his memories. He sat among a sea of unfamiliar faces, the soft fabric of the pew feeling strange beneath his hands. A man, young and impeccably dressed, stood at the front, bathed in a spotlight. He had a microphone, which made his voice boom and echo even though he wasn't shouting. This preacher, with a smile fixed firmly on his face, spoke with an energy that felt, to Bunyan, manufactured. His words, however, were what truly struck Bunyan. The sermon was about the 23rd Psalm, a passage Bunyan knew intimately, a passage that had been his comfort in the darkest hours. But this preacher twisted it. He reduced the profound spiritual meaning to something shallow, something that felt almost insulting. "God wants you to be wealthy," the preacher declared, his voice rising to a crescendo that seemed to electrify the room. "The Lord is your shepherd, so claim your riches now. He doesn't want you struggling. He wants you blessed, abundant, prosperous." Bunyan felt a familiar ache in his chest, a deep disrespect for the spiritual depth he had known, lived, and suffered for. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in a quiet moment of internal reckoning. A faint, knowing smile played on his lips. It was a silent declaration, a promise to himself that a greater truth was about to be unveiled, a truth that this charismatic yet superficial figure was entirely missing. Around him, a few congregants shifted. They weren't quite as captivated as the preacher might have hoped. A woman in the third row exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with her husband. A young man fiddled with his phone, his brow furrowed. The words, "God wants you to be wealthy," hung in the air, a heavy, almost suffocating presence for some. They seemed to sense, even if they couldn't articulate it, that something was off. Bunyan heard it in their subtle movements, in the way the energy in the room dipped slightly. He knew this feeling, this unease that settled when the sacred was made profane. It was a pattern he'd seen before, a dangerous path. For where man seeks gold, he often loses God. The thought formed clearly in his mind, a simple, undeniable truth that instantly aligned with his perspective, and he felt somehow that it resonated with those few uncomfortable souls around him. He opened his eyes slowly. The bright lights of the stage seemed to dim, or perhaps it was his own vision sharpening. His gaze, deep and full of a profound sense of purpose, settled directly on the camera, as if he were looking into the eyes of each person watching, each person who might be feeling that same unease. He had a story to tell, a truth to share, that went far beyond the gilded promises of earthly riches. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. John Bunyan's journey started long before that brightly lit church, back in the muddy lanes and smoky cottages of 17th century England. Bedford, his home, was a small town, a place where life was hard and faith was often a matter of survival. It was a time when religious belief wasn't just personal, it was political, woven into the very fabric of society, but in a way that often felt suffocating. The English Civil War had just ended, leaving behind a nation grappling with its identity, both spiritual and governmental. For someone like Bunyan, a tinker by trade, born into a working-class family, life was a constant struggle. He knew the grime of the road, the clang of metal, and the gnawing hunger that could settle in your belly. But more than that, he knew a different kind of hunger, a spiritual one. The established Church of England, with its grand cathedrals and formal rituals, felt distant, its sermons often cold and detached from the real, messy lives of people like him. He battled with his own inner demons, a restless soul seeking something more, something real. He spent his early years wrestling with guilt, with the fear of damnation, and with a deep, unsettling sense of his own unworthiness. He was a young man given to swearing and revelry, and the weight of his perceived sins pressed heavily on him. He yearned for a genuine connection with God, a personal understanding that went beyond the rote prayers and prescribed doctrines offered by the parish priest. This was his vulnerability, this raw, open yearning for truth. His dreams weren't of wealth or power, but of peace for his soul, of understanding the divine plan, and of sharing that understanding with others who felt as lost as he did. He wanted to speak directly to God, to hear his voice, not through the filtered words of an institution, but in the quiet depths of his own heart. His spiritual awakening wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, painful unfolding. He found solace and guidance not in the formal church, but among small groups of nonconformists, people who met in secret, away from the watchful eyes of the authorities. These were individuals who, like him, questioned the rigid structures and sought a more direct, personal relationship with their Creator. They read the Bible for themselves, debated its meanings, and found a freedom in worship that the established church denied them. This was where the first seeds of conflict were sown. The established church, with its bishops and ministers, represented the very opposite of what Bunyan sought. They were the gatekeepers of faith, the interpreters of God's word, and their authority was backed by the power of the state. They preached a doctrine that often focused on obedience to church hierarchy, on conforming to prescribed rituals, and on maintaining social order. For them, Bunyan and his fellow nonconformists were a threat, a challenge to their power and their carefully constructed world. These ministers, often educated and privileged, saw themselves as the rightful shepherds of the flock. They believed they held the sole key to spiritual truth, and anyone who dared to preach outside their sanctioned pulpits was seen as a dangerous rebel, a spreader of sedition. This was the antagonist Bunyan would face throughout his life, an institutional interpretation of faith that prioritized control and conformity over genuine spiritual experience. It was a system that, in its pursuit of order, often stifled the very spirit it claimed to serve. Bunyan's humble origins, his lack of formal education, and his passionate, unscripted preaching were all seen as affronts to this established order. He was a voice from the wilderness, challenging the comfortable certainties of the powerful, setting the stage for a long, hard fight for the soul of faith itself. The memories from Bunyan's life, even before his imprisonment, were full of small moments that showed how the gap between real faith and the church's rules kept growing. He saw how the established church often spoke of God's love, but then acted in ways that felt cold and uncaring. It was like they offered a promise of spiritual comfort, but when people truly needed it, they found only empty words or worse, subtle put-downs. He remembered the way the parish priests would look down on the common folk, especially those who dared to question anything. There was one time, early in his spiritual journey, when he had gone to a local church official, hoping for guidance about a troubling passage in the Bible. Instead of help, he got a lecture about respecting authority and not trying to interpret sacred texts on his own. The official, a man with a booming voice and a silk robe, had made him feel small, as if his honest questions were an insult. It wasn't outright cruelty, but a kind of veiled humiliation that chipped away at his trust. These were the broken promises, the church claiming to be a shepherd for all, but then turning away those who didn't fit neatly into its flock. Bunyan saw how the official doctrines were often used not to uplift souls, but to maintain power and control. He witnessed people being shamed for their simple, heartfelt expressions of faith, especially if those expressions didn't come from a sanctioned sermon or a prescribed prayer book. The manipulation wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was in the way the local gentry, often allied with the church, used religious language to justify harsh social inequalities. God has put everyone in their place, they would say, implying that poverty was a divine decree, not a consequence of human systems. Bunyan saw through this. He knew that the true message of Christ was about compassion and justice, not about keeping the poor in their place. Then came the more direct injustices. As he started preaching, sharing his newfound understanding of the Bible with anyone who would listen, he became a target. He wasn't trained in their schools, he didn't have their degrees, and he certainly didn't have their permission. He preached in barns, in fields, in small gatherings, and his words, simple yet powerful, resonated with people who felt ignored by the official church. This was a direct challenge to the authority that the established church treasured. They saw his independent preaching as a form of rebellion, a dangerous act that could upset the social and religious order. The laws were clear. You could not preach without a license from the Anglican Church. Bunyan, driven by his conviction that God had called him to speak, refused to stop. The consequences were swift and brutal. He was arrested, thrown into prison, not for any crime against society, but for daring to share his faith in a way that defied the institutional rules. His imprisonment wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a system designed to crush dissent. It was the culmination of years of spiritual disillusionment and oppression that he and many others like him had faced. This wasn't just about Bunyan's personal struggle. It was a reflection of how religious authority, when unchecked, could be twisted to serve human agendas rather than divine ones. The shepherds of the established church were acting more like jailers, using their power to silence voices that spoke of a different kind of truth. For Bunyan, this period of injustice, sitting in a cold cell, reinforced everything he had come to believe, that true faith wasn't found in grand cathedrals or rigid doctrines, but in the direct, personal relationship between an individual and God, a relationship that no institution could truly control or define. He knew, deep in his heart, that the conflict wasn't just his own, but a battle for the very soul of faith itself. The air around Bunyan grew thick with unspoken tension. His simple, heartfelt sermons, delivered not from a pulpit but from the heart, started to draw people in. They found comfort and truth in his words, a stark contrast to the often cold pronouncements from the official church. This growing following, however, wasn't a blessing in the eyes of the authorities. It was a threat. The more people gathered to hear him, the more the whispers turned into loud accusations. It felt like the walls were closing in, the pressure mounting with each new convert. Discussions about him weren't just confined to church leaders anymore. They seeped into the taverns, the marketplaces, and even homes. People took sides. Some defended him, remembering his earnestness and the powerful way he spoke about God's love. Others, especially those with something to lose or those who feared change, sided with the established order. They talked about him as a troublemaker, a radical, someone who was upsetting the peace and challenging the rightful authority of the church and the crown. The social pressure became immense. It wasn't just the fear of arrest that weighed on Bunyan. It was the judgment from society itself. Neighbors who once offered a friendly nod now averted their gaze. Respected citizens, pillars of the community who had always seemed fair, now openly condemned his actions. Even within his own community, among those who shared his nonconformist beliefs, there was a subtle fracturing. Some, out of fear for their own safety or livelihoods, urged him to be more careful, to temper his words, to compromise. They didn't understand that compromise was not an option for him when it came to speaking what he believed was God's truth. This judgment was like a constant low hum, a background noise to his daily life that slowly eroded his sense of belonging. He felt isolated, even when surrounded by his most loyal followers. The dominant religious narrative, backed by the full power of the state, painted him as an enemy of order, a dangerous man. This created a climate of suspicion and fear, making it hard for anyone to openly support him without risking their own standing. He saw the fear in the eyes of his wife, Elizabeth, as she worried about his next sermon, about the consequences. He saw it in the hushed conversations among his friends when a church official walked by. This was the moment of greatest emotional suffocation. It wasn't the physical pain of prison yet, but the crushing weight of public disapproval, the feeling of being an outcast in his own land for simply trying to live out his faith authentically. Bunyan often found himself walking alone, wrestling with these feelings. He questioned himself, not about his faith, but about his methods. Was he being too stubborn? Was he bringing unnecessary hardship upon his loved ones? These were not easy questions, and they gnawed at him. Yet every time he considered stepping back, every time the thought of silence crept into his mind, he would remember the faces of the people who found hope in his words, the quiet desperation in their eyes, and the conviction that God had indeed called him to this path. His commitment to his understanding of God's word, to the true meaning of "the Lord is my shepherd," as a spiritual guide rather than a promise of earthly comforts, remained unwavering. It was an internal struggle, a battle fought within the confines of his own heart and mind, far from the public eye. This inner turmoil, this steadfast refusal to bend, was what defined him. He knew that to yield now would be to betray not just himself, but the very truth he believed in. The tension was unsustainable, the breaking point drawing near, but his resolve, forged in the fires of personal conviction and societal condemnation, only grew stronger. He was ready for whatever came next, because he knew his shepherd was with him, even if no one else understood. The breaking point finally arrived, not with a sudden crash, but with the chilling finality of a prison door clanging shut. John Bunyan was arrested, and after refusing to stop preaching, was thrown into Bedford jail. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a profound, life-altering event that changed everything he knew. The stone walls, the damp air, the forced idleness, these were meant to break his spirit, to make him conform, to silence his voice. But what his persecutors saw as a punishment, Bunyan slowly began to see as something else entirely. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The initial shock gave way to a deep, agonizing sorrow for his family, especially his blind daughter. He worried about their welfare, about the burden his imprisonment placed on them. He fought moments of despair, those dark hours when doubt tried to creep in and whisper that he had been wrong, that his suffering was pointless. Yet, even in the deepest pits of his confinement, a quiet, persistent truth began to surface. The revelation wasn't some grand external miracle. There were no angels appearing in his cell, no booming voices from the heavens. Instead, it was an internal shift, a profound and devastating realization that solidified his understanding of God's unwavering presence. He learned that true shepherding wasn't about being led to green pastures and still waters in a literal sense, free from worldly troubles. It was about finding those green pastures and still waters within, even when surrounded by the harsh realities of a prison cell. God was not just with him in prosperity, but deeply, intimately present in his suffering. The Lord was his shepherd, guiding him through the valley of the shadow of death, which for Bunyan was very real and very close. This understanding was devastating because it stripped away any lingering hope for an easy escape, any expectation of earthly comfort as a sign of divine favor. But it was also incredibly liberating. It meant his faith didn't depend on his circumstances, on whether he was free or imprisoned, rich or poor. It depended only on God. With this deeper understanding came a decision. He couldn't preach from the pulpit anymore, but he could write. He could articulate this spiritual journey, this profound truth about God's steadfast love and guidance, in a way that words spoken in a field never could. He began to see his imprisonment not as an end, but as an unexpected opportunity. The very walls meant to silence him became the crucible in which his greatest work would be forged. He started writing, not just sermons, but an allegory, a story that would speak to the hearts of ordinary people, transcending the rigid theological debates of his time. He began to craft The Pilgrim's Progress, a narrative that would weave his own experiences of spiritual struggle, doubt, and ultimate triumph into a universal tale. He wanted to show that true shepherding was about spiritual guidance, about navigating the treacherous paths of life with faith as your compass, not about accumulating earthly possessions or escaping hardship. This act of writing, born out of deep suffering and profound revelation, broke the cycle of personal despair. It shifted his narrative from one of a persecuted preacher to that of a spiritual guide whose message would resonate for centuries. His pen became his new pulpit, and the prison cell, far from being a tomb, transformed into a workshop for eternal truths. He realized that the superficial prosperity gospel preached by some, even in his own time, missed the entire point. God's shepherding was about guiding the soul, preparing it for an eternal journey, not just making life comfortable here on earth. This insight, forged in the darkness of his confinement, offered an unexpected path to enduring impact, making his voice louder and more influential than any sermon he could have delivered before his arrest. The immediate consequences of Bunyan's imprisonment were harsh. He faced the cold stone walls of his cell, the constant gnawing doubts that whispered in his mind. Had he made the right choices? Was his unwavering faith truly justified, or was he simply a stubborn fool, separated from his family and his flock? Shame sometimes washed over him, a heavy blanket of regret for the suffering his convictions brought upon his wife and children. He felt the sting of isolation, the endless hours stretching out with nothing but his thoughts for company. Yet, even amidst this suffering, something else began to stir within him, a strange, powerful explosion of creative and spiritual energy. He had decided to write, and that decision unlocked a torrent. The words flowed from him, filling page after page, transforming his prison into a workshop of divine inspiration. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a storyteller, a theologian, a poet. His mind, though confined, soared, building worlds and characters out of his own spiritual journey. The very act of writing became his defiance, his sermon, his prayer. Other prisoners around him reacted in different ways. Some were hardened criminals, indifferent to the quiet man who scribbled endlessly in his corner. They saw him as just another soul caught in the system, perhaps a little mad with his religious fervor. But others, men of faith, or those simply seeking solace in their own despair, found themselves drawn to Bunyan. They would listen as he read passages from his developing manuscript, their eyes widening at the allegories, their spirits lifted by the hope woven into his words. These men became his first audience, his early critics, and in some cases, his allies. They offered him what little comfort they could, a shared piece of bread, a friendly word, a moment of quiet understanding. They saw not just a prisoner, but a man touched by something profound. The jailers, too, were a mixed bag. Some were brutal, enforcing the strict religious laws of 17th century England with a cruel hand. They saw Bunyan as a dangerous dissenter, a threat to the established church and social order. They mocked his writing, confiscating his papers when they felt like it, making his life harder. But others, perhaps less zealous or simply more curious, were intrigued. They might sneak him extra paper or a fresh candle, sensing the importance of his work, even if they didn't fully understand it. The cultural dynamics of the time meant that religious conformity was paramount. To preach outside the approved church was a crime, and Bunyan was a living example of that. The authorities wanted to break him, to make an example of him, but his pen was proving to be a weapon they hadn't anticipated. His family, outside the prison walls, bore the heaviest psychological impact. His wife, Elizabeth, fought tirelessly for his release, petitioning judges and authorities, facing rejection and scorn. She carried the burden of raising their children, one of whom was blind, without her husband's presence or income. The shame of his imprisonment, the social ostracization that came with being the family of a nonconformist preacher, weighed heavily on them. Yet, their love and loyalty remained steadfast. Bunyan, in turn, felt their absence acutely. the quiet ache of missing his loved ones, the guilt of the hardship he caused. This personal suffering, however, did not break his resolve. Instead, it sharpened it. His writing became a testament not just to his faith, but to their endurance, a legacy he hoped would one day justify their sacrifices. He was not just writing for himself, but for them, for the truth, and for all who sought a deeper understanding of God's true shepherding. The years of imprisonment eventually ended. John Bunyan walked out of Bedford jail a free man, but he was not the same man who had been locked away. He was older, yes, but also transformed. The chains had not bound his spirit. Instead, they had forged it, sharpening his vision and deepening his understanding. His physical release was just one part of a larger re-emergence. While his body had been confined, his mind had been busy building a world, a journey, a truth. The manuscript he carried, The Pilgrim's Progress, was more than just a book. It was the reconstruction of his life's purpose. It was his answer to the superficial interpretations of faith he had seen, the empty promises and the manipulations. It was his quiet, yet powerful act of justice against those who had twisted the sacred into a tool for earthly gain. He didn't seek revenge or public condemnation for his persecutors. His justice was redemptive, a spreading of truth that would outlast any prison sentence or any fleeting sermon. Initially, the book's success was modest, but it quickly grew. Word spread through the dissenting communities, then to a wider public. People saw themselves in Christian's journey, in his struggles, his doubts, and his ultimate triumph. The allegory resonated deeply because it spoke to universal human experiences, couched in a language accessible to all, not just scholars or theologians. It offered a profound answer to the question, what does "the Lord is my shepherd" truly mean? Bunyan's book showed that true shepherding wasn't about immediate comfort or material wealth. It was about guidance through the wilderness of life, protection from spiritual dangers, sustenance for the soul, and the promise of an eternal home, even when the path was hard and fraught with peril. The impact was immense and unexpected. The Pilgrim's Progress became an instant classic, translated into countless languages, read by generations. It transcended religious denominations, speaking to the human condition itself. It became a cornerstone of English literature, influencing writers and thinkers for centuries. The truth it contained, that spiritual abundance and perseverance were the real treasures, began to permeate the cultural consciousness, quietly correcting the very misinterpretations that had landed Bunyan in prison. The superficial preachers and the rigid institutions that had condemned him found their messages paling in comparison to the enduring power of Bunyan's allegorical tale. Their focus on earthly gains, on prosperity as a sign of God's favor, began to sound hollow when contrasted with the deep spiritual journey outlined in his work. The justice was not a dramatic fall for his antagonists, but rather the quiet, steady rise of a deeper, more profound understanding of faith, one that his book championed. His work taught that God's shepherding was not a guarantee of an easy life, but a promise of presence through every trial. It was about finding strength in adversity, hope in despair, and a steady hand to guide one through the valley of the shadow of death itself. It was about spiritual resilience, not material accumulation. And so, John Bunyan's journey, from a simple tinker to an imprisoned preacher, from a persecuted dissenter to one of history's most influential writers, found its satisfying and realistic resolution. He didn't defeat his antagonists with force or argument, but with an enduring masterpiece that spoke a timeless truth. The profound spiritual meaning of "the Lord is my shepherd," once distorted by greed and misunderstanding, was finally, and beautifully, restored to its rightful place, influencing countless souls for generations to come. His legacy wasn't just a book, it was a re-education, a quiet revolution of the heart, reminding everyone that true shepherding leads to spiritual abundance, not fleeting earthly gains.